Snow fell so hard that night that the road outside Bramblewick village had vanished under a white sheet, and a man stumbled through it with his boots torn open at the toes. He pounded on the first door with a lit window, his knuckles raw, his breath freezing before it left his mouth. Inside that small stone cottage, a family of 3 sat close to a weak fire, rationing the last of their bread, when the knock nearly knocked the door off its hinges. Walter Marsh rose first, gripping the fire poker like a weapon, because strangers who arrived in storms rarely brought good news. His wife, Nora, pulled their daughter Eliza back by the arm, though Eliza was 19 and no longer a child who needed shielding. When Walter opened the door, the wind rushed in first, and then the stranger, half frozen, fell forward onto the floorboards. He wore a coat, so patched and filthy that its original color could not be guessed. His beard was crusted with ice, his hands blue at the fingertips, and yet when he lifted his face to look at them, his eyes were sharp and alert in a way that unsettled Walter more than any weapon could have. "Please," the stranger said, his voice hoarse, "only shelter. I ask for nothing else." Nora exchanged a look with her husband. They had little enough to feed themselves through the winter, let alone a fourth mouth, but no decent person turned away a dying man from their door, not even in a village as poor and forgotten as Bramblewick. Walter helped him to the fire, and Eliza, without being asked, fetched the one blanket they could spare. The stranger did not speak much that first hour. He simply sat, letting warmth crawl back into his frozen limbs, watching the family with a quiet, careful attention that Eliza noticed even if her parents did not. There was something in the way he held himself, straight-backed even while exhausted, that did not match his ragged clothes. It was Walter, loosened by relief and a bit of cheap wine he kept for hard nights, who made the joke that would follow them all for the rest of their lives. "Well," he said, laughing too loudly, the kind of laugh men use to cover fear, "if you want a warm bed so badly, stranger, you can have my daughter's hand for the night. She keeps the house warmer than any fire." Nora laughed too, swatting her husband's arm, though her eyes carried a flicker of nervous apology toward the stranger, as if daring him to take the joke seriously, and knowing full well he would not. It was the kind of crude humor poor families use to laugh at their own poverty, a way of saying, "We have nothing else to offer you but our daughter's company by the fire." Eliza felt her face burn hotter than the flames beside her. She wanted to sink into the floor. "Father," she said sharply, mortified, "that is not funny." The stranger said nothing for a long moment. Then, slowly, something shifted in his expression, something between amusement and interest, though he masked it quickly enough that only Eliza caught the change. He inclined his head toward Walter with unexpected grace. "Your hospitality is more generous than most," he said simply, and let the matter drop. Eliza turned away to hide her embarrassment, busying herself with the kettle, refusing to look at the stranger again that night. She did not see the way his gaze followed her movements around the small kitchen, studying her not as a father's crude joke had framed her, but as a man studying a woman whose grace and dignity had survived hardship that should have crushed it. They gave him a place near the fire to sleep, an old straw mat and the one blanket, while the family retreated to the single back room they all shared. Eliza lay awake long after her parents' breathing evened into sleep, replaying the humiliation of her father's joke, wondering who this strange, quiet man truly was, and why his presence made the small cottage feel different, as though the air itself had shifted. In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving the village buried under drifts taller than a man. The stranger woke early, before even Walter, and Eliza found him outside, already clearing snow from their doorway with a shovel he must have found in the shed. "You don't need to do that," she said, standing in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "I would rather work than accept charity I cannot repay," he answered, not stopping his task. His breath fogged in the morning air. "Your family has little enough. I won't take more than I give." Eliza studied him properly for the first time in daylight. Beneath the grime and the tangled beard, his features were finer than she expected. His hands, though roughened by the cold, moved with a precision that spoke of some skill beyond common labor. But it was his manner of speaking that struck her most. Beggars who wandered the roads of Bramblewick spoke plainly, if they spoke at all. This man chose his words the way a merchant chose coins, carefully, deliberately, as though each one carried weight. "What is your name?" she asked. He paused, just for a heartbeat, a hesitation so brief she nearly missed it. Julian, he said. Just Julian. Just Julian, she repeated, testing the words. And where were you traveling, before the storm caught you? Nowhere in particular, he said, which she immediately understood to be a lie, though a harmless one. I was seeing the land. Sometimes a man forgets what his own country looks like, when he only ever sees it from a comfortable window. It was a strange thing to say, and Eliza filed it away without understanding it, the way one remembers an odd dream upon waking. Her parents emerged soon after, startled to find the stranger already at work, and Walter, embarrassed now by sober daylight for the joke he had made the night before, mumbled something about breakfast being ready if the stranger cared to join them. Julian accepted with the same quiet grace he had shown the previous night, and the four of them ate together, a thin porridge stretched to feed one more mouth. You'll be moving on then, Nora said, half a question, half a hope that he would not, because despite everything, there was something reassuring about having another set of capable hands in the house during the hardest weeks of winter. If you would allow it, Julian said, I would like to stay a few days more, and work in exchange for your kindness. I have some skill with repairs. Your roof, if I am not mistaken, has a weak beam above the eastern corner. Walter blinked in surprise, because the beam in question had indeed begun to sag, a problem he had been dreading dealing with, once the ground thawed enough to gather proper timber. How could you have noticed that from one night by the fire? Julian only smiled faintly. I notice things. It is a habit I have never managed to break. And so it was decided, without much more discussion, that the tattered stranger would stay in the Marsh household a little longer, sleeping by the fire, eating what little they had, and working through the frozen days to repair what he could. Eliza told herself this arrangement meant nothing to her beyond simple practicality, that her curiosity about him was no different than anyone's curiosity about an unusual visitor to a small village. She almost believed it, but over the following days, she found herself watching him more than she intended to. She watched him fix the sagging beam with quiet competence, watched him split firewood with steady, even strokes, watched him treat her parents with a respect that seemed almost out of place given how little they had to offer him in return. Beggars, in her limited experience, were often desperate men, quick to take what they could, and quicker still, to disappear once they had taken it. Julian took nothing he had not earned through his own labor, and offered more than anyone expected of a stranger, with torn boots and a threadbare coat. One evening, while her parents visited a neighboring farm to trade what little surplus they had for salt and thread, Eliza found herself alone with Julian by the fire for the first time. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, though it carried a weight she could not name. Your father's joke troubled you, Julian said suddenly, without looking up from the length of wood he was carving into a new door hinge. The first night, Eliza's cheeks warmed again at the memory. My father says foolish things when he is frightened and relieved at once. He meant nothing by it. I hope you did not take offense. I took no offense, Julian said, and there was something gentle in his tone that surprised her. In truth, I found it rather honest. Most people I have met offer kindness with strings attached, hoping for something in return before the words have even left their mouths. Your father offered a joke born of poverty and worry, nothing more, and beneath it, real shelter, real food, real warmth. I have encountered far worse, dressed in far finer manners. Eliza considered this. You speak as though you have known a great many dishonest people. More than I would like, he admitted, and for the briefest moment, something like weariness crossed his face, an old exhaustion that did not belong to a man his age, whatever that age truly was. It is easier, sometimes, to trust a stranger by a fire than the people closest to you. She wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to press further into the shadow that had crossed his expression, but something in his posture told her the door had closed again, at least for tonight. Instead, she asked something safer. Where did you learn to carve? And to fix roofs? And read the weather? And speak the way you do? You are no common wanderer, Julian, whoever you claim to be. He looked up at her then, and for a heartbeat, his eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch, though she could not have said why. I have had many teachers, he said carefully, some kinder than others, and I would rather you judge me by what you have seen with your own eyes these past days, than by what stories a ragged coat might suggest. It was not an answer, not really, but Eliza found she did not mind. There was something oddly comforting in a mystery that did not demand to be solved immediately, a man who revealed himself slowly, in small, honest actions, rather than grand declarations. She had grown up in a village where everyone knew everyone else's business, before it had even fully happened, where gossip traveled faster than the wind through the valley. A man who kept his own counsel, who chose his words like a merchant weighing coins, was something entirely new to her. Her parents returned before the conversation could continue, laden with a small sack of salt and a spool of thread, and the moment dissolved back into the ordinary rhythms of the household. But that night, lying awake in the dark, Eliza found her thoughts circling back again and again to the stranger sleeping by their fire, to the careful way he spoke, to the quiet dignity he carried despite his torn boots and patched coat. She told herself it was only curiosity. She was 19, and curiosity was a natural thing. But some quiet, honest part of her already suspected that whatever this feeling was, it went deeper than simple curiosity, and that the tattered stranger her father had joked about giving her hand to was becoming, day by day, someone she thought about far too often for her own comfort. Outside, the winter wind howled against the cottage walls, but inside, for the first time in longer than Eliza could remember, the small house did not feel entirely defined by its poverty. It felt, instead, like the beginning of something she did not yet have words for, something that had arrived out of a storm, wrapped in rags, carrying secrets she had not yet begun to imagine. The days that followed settled into a rhythm none of the Marsh family had expected to welcome so easily. Julian rose before dawn each morning, working through the frost-hardened chores, before Walter had even finished his first cup of weak tea, and by the time the sun climbed fully over the eastern ridge, half the repairs the family had been dreading for months were already finished or well underway. The sagging beam was fixed. The chicken coop, which had leaned dangerously to one side since autumn, stood straight again. A cracked window frame no longer let the wind whistle through at night. Nora watched all of this with growing wonder, and growing suspicion in equal measure. She said nothing of it directly to her husband, not at first, but Eliza caught her mother studying Julian across the dinner table more than once. Her eyes narrowed slightly, the way she studied a piece of cloth at market, to determine if the merchant had lied about its quality. "He works too well for a beggar," Nora finally said one evening, once Julian had gone outside to check the animals before sleep. She kept her voice low, though the cottage was small enough that secrets rarely stayed secrets for long. "Beggars know how to ask. They do not know how to build a hinge from scrap wood so precisely it barely needs oiling." Walter shrugged, though Eliza noticed the shrug came a beat too slowly, as though he had already been turning the same thought over in his own mind. Perhaps he learned a trade before hard times found him. "It happens. Men fall from comfortable lives all the time, Nora. War, illness, bad debts. It is not so strange." "And his speech?" Nora pressed. "Have you listened to him closely? He speaks like the magistrate who visited 2 summers ago to settle the boundary dispute with the Hollis farm. Not like any wandering laborer I have ever met." Eliza, pretending to focus on mending a torn sleeve by the fire, listened closely without appearing to. She had noticed the very same things herself, of course, turning them over during long nights when sleep would not come. But hearing her mother voice the suspicion aloud made it feel more real, more urgent, than it had felt as a private curiosity locked away in her own thoughts. "Whatever he was before," Walter said finally, "he is a good worker now, and an honest one. I have seen no cause to distrust him. Let the man keep his past to himself if he wishes. We have all buried things we would rather not speak of." The conversation ended there, but it lingered in the air of the small cottage like smoke that refused to clear. Eliza found herself watching Julian with new eyes after that, no longer simply curious about a mysterious stranger, but genuinely searching, piece by piece, for some explanation that would make sense of the contradictions surrounding him. It happened on a morning when Julian accompanied Walter to the village center to trade a small surplus of preserved vegetables for oil and candles, a task Eliza had volunteered to join, telling herself it was only because she needed thread from the weaver's stall. Bramblewick was not a large village, but it drew traders and travelers from the surrounding countryside on market mornings, and among the modest stalls and haggling voices, an unfamiliar carriage stood near the well, its wheels caked with mud from a long journey, its sides bearing a crest Eliza did not recognize, but instinctively understood to belong to someone important. 2 men in fine traveling coats stood beside the carriage, speaking with the village elder in hushed, urgent tones. Eliza noticed Julian's posture change the moment his eyes fell upon them, a subtle stiffening of his shoulders, a wariness that had not been present in him since the night he first stumbled through her family's door. "Is something wrong?" she asked quietly, falling into step beside him as they crossed the square. "No," he said, too quickly. "Merely travelers, likely lost on their way to the eastern estates." But his eyes did not leave the carriage until they had passed well beyond it, and Eliza noticed, with a small jolt of unease, that one of the finely dressed men had turned his head to watch Julian pass, his expression sharpening with something like recognition, before Julian steered them quickly around a corner and out of sight. "You know him," Eliza said, once they were alone again near the weaver's stall, her father having wandered off to negotiate the price of oil. Julian did not deny it immediately, which told her more than any words could have. "I have encountered many people in my travels," he said carefully. "It does not mean every face I recognize belongs to someone I wish to speak with again." "That is not an answer." "No," he admitted, and for the first time since she had known him, something like genuine discomfort flickered across his features. "It is not." Eliza wanted to press further, but the weaver called her attention to a bolt of cloth, and by the time she turned back, Walter had returned with the oil, and the moment for questions had passed. Still, the unease settled into her chest and refused to leave, a small stone she carried with her for the rest of the day. That evening, back at the cottage, Nora raised the matter of the carriage before Eliza even had the chance to mention it herself. "The Hollis boy told me those men were asking after someone," Nora said, setting bowls of thin stew on the table with more force than necessary. "A traveler," they said, "someone important who had gone missing from the ducal estate weeks ago. They offered coin for information." Walter's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. Eliza felt her pulse quicken, though she could not have said exactly why the news frightened her as much as it did. "The ducal estate," Walter repeated slowly, setting his spoon down entirely now. His eyes moved, almost against his will, toward Julian, who sat at the end of the table, his expression carefully, deliberately neutral, in a way that suddenly seemed far more suspicious than any nervousness would have been. "Julian," Walter said, his voice low and careful, the voice of a man choosing his next words with great caution. "Is there something you have not told us?" The silence that followed stretched long enough that Eliza felt the weight of it pressing against her ribs. Julian set down his own spoon, folding his rough, work-worn hands together on the table, and for a moment, he looked less like the humble laborer who had spent the past days fixing beams and hinges, and more like a man who had spent a lifetime measuring his words before a room full of people waiting to judge him. "There are things about my past I have chosen not to share," he said finally. "Not because I mean to deceive you, but because I have valued, more than you can know, being seen simply as a man, judged only by my actions, rather than by whatever name or title might precede me. These past days in your home have been among the most honest of my life. I did not wish to lose that so quickly." "Title," Nora repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, her hand tightening around the edge of the table. "What title, Julian?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes moved to Eliza, holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat, and for a long moment, it felt as though the rest of the room, her parents, the fire, the thin stew growing cold in its bowls, had all faded into distant background noise, leaving only the two of them, and the truth he was about to speak. "My name is not simply Julian," he said quietly. "It is Julian Ashcombe, and I am the Duke of this region, the very land your village stands upon." The words landed in the small cottage like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward in ripples of stunned silence. Walter's face drained of color entirely, and Nora's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled sound escaping her that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Eliza felt the room tilt slightly around her, the fire's warmth suddenly feeling very far away. Every moment of the past days rearranged itself in her mind with new and terrifying clarity. The careful speech, the precise skills that spoke of an education far beyond common labor, the men in fine coats who had recognized him from across the square, the way even the village elder had seemed unusually deferential toward the strangers asking after a missing traveler. "You are the Duke," she repeated numbly, the words feeling foreign and impossible in her mouth. "The Duke of Ashcombe." "Yes," he said, and for the first time since she had known him, his composure wavered, something almost like fear crossing his features. though it was not fear of her family's reaction, she realized slowly. It was fear of losing something he had only just begun to find. "And my father," Eliza said, her voice rising now, edged with a horror that made her stomach twist violently, "offered you my hand as a joke. To your face. Not knowing you were—" She could not finish the sentence, could not bring herself to voice the full, terrible weight of what her family had unknowingly done, mocking, however lightly, the very man who held authority over their land, their livelihoods, their entire future. Walter had gone completely still, his face ashen, his hands trembling faintly where they rested on the table. Eliza had never in her life seen her father look so afraid, not during the worst famine years, not during the fever that had nearly taken Nora 3 winters ago. This fear was different, sharper, the fear of a man who suddenly understood he might have unknowingly offended someone with the power to destroy everything he had ever worked to build. "Your Grace," Walter began, his voice cracking, sliding from his chair to kneel on the cold floor in a gesture of desperate apology. "I meant no disrespect. I swear it before every saint I know. It was foolishness born of relief and fear. Nothing more. Please, I beg you." "Walter, please, stand up," Julian said quickly, rising from his own seat, reaching out as though to physically stop the older man from continuing to kneel before him. His voice had lost none of its gentleness, though it now carried an authority Eliza had not fully recognized until this moment, an authority that had been present all along, quietly woven beneath the humble manner he had shown them. "You owe me no apology. If anything, I owe your family a debt I do not know how to properly repay." "A debt," Nora echoed faintly, still pressed back against the wall as though trying to make herself as small as possible in the presence of nobility she had, days earlier, fed thin porridge without a second thought. "You took in a stranger during a storm, expecting nothing in return," Julian said, his eyes moving slowly around the small cottage, taking in its modest furnishings, its careful poverty, with something that looked almost like reverence. "You shared what little food you had. You gave me your only blanket. And when you made that joke, Walter, crude as it might have felt to your daughter in the moment, it was the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years. No flattery in it, no calculation. Only the plain, tired humor of a man grateful to be alive through another storm." Eliza stood frozen near the fire, watching this exchange unfold with a strange, dizzying sense of unreality. The man she had come to know over these past days, the careful carver of hinges, the patient repairer of sagging beams, the quiet listener who had shared fragments of weariness she had not understood until now, all of it remained true, and yet everything had changed in the span of a single sentence. "Why did you not tell us sooner?" she asked quietly, once the initial shock had settled enough to allow her voice to steady. "Why let us believe you were simply a wandering stranger?" Julian turned to face her fully now, and something in his expression softened, grew almost vulnerable, in a way she had not seen from him before, not even during their quiet conversation by the fire days earlier. "Because for the first time in longer than I can remember," he said, "I was not treated as a title, or a purse of coin, or a man whose favor might be won through flattery. I was simply Julian, sitting by a fire, welcome not because of what I could offer, but because your family believed, even without knowing who I was, that no one should be left to freeze in a storm. I did not want that to end the moment I spoke my name." The cottage fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft crackle of the dying fire. Eliza felt a tangle of emotions she could not easily sort through, embarrassment at her father's joke now carrying far greater weight than before, fear of what consequences might yet follow, and beneath it all, something quieter, and far more difficult to name, a lingering warmth toward the man who had chosen, even briefly, to be seen only as himself. But even as that warmth stirred within her, a colder thought followed close behind it, settling uneasily in her chest. If he was truly the Duke, if his identity carried the weight of land and law and power over every family in Bramblewick, then whatever had begun to grow between them during these quiet winter days could no longer be simple. It could no longer belong only to a poor farmer's daughter and a ragged stranger by the fire. It now belonged to a duke, and the daughter of one of his own poorest tenants, and Eliza did not yet know whether that truth would draw them closer together, or tear apart the fragile, honest thing that had begun to grow between them, before either of them had understood what it truly was. Outside, the wind had died down to a low murmur against the cottage walls. But inside, the air remained thick with unspoken questions. Questions that would not wait much longer for answers, now that the truth had finally, irrevocably, been spoken aloud. News of a kind travels faster than any wagon, no matter how carefully a family tries to guard its secrets. And by the following afternoon, half of Bramblewick already whispered that the ragged traveler who had wintered at the Marsh cottage was in truth the Duke of Ashcombe himself. Eliza could not say for certain how the news had spread so quickly, whether the men in fine coats had questioned someone at the market, or whether the village elder, so unusually deferential the day before, had let something slip in his own nervous excitement. Whatever the cause, by the time she walked to the well that morning, 3 separate neighbors stopped her, with wide eyes and eager questions she had no wish to answer. "Is it true?" old Mistress Bellamy asked, gripping Eliza's sleeve with surprising strength for a woman of her age, "that the Duke himself slept upon your floor these past weeks? That your father offered you to him as a jest, not knowing?" Eliza felt heat rush to her face, the humiliation of that first night returning as fresh and sharp as it had been in the moment itself, now multiplied 100-fold by the knowledge that the entire village would soon know every detail, exaggerated and reshaped with each retelling. "My father meant no harm by it," she said stiffly, pulling her sleeve free. "It was only a joke, spoken before either of us knew who our guest truly was. A joke that might have cost your family everything, had the Duke taken offense," Mistress Bellamy said, not unkindly, though the warning in her tone was unmistakable. "You are fortunate he seems a patient man. Not every noble would have forgiven such an insult so easily." Eliza carried that warning home with her, along with 2 heavy buckets of water, and found the cottage in a state of quiet, anxious disarray. Nora had scrubbed every surface twice over since sunrise, as though sheer cleanliness might somehow undo the impropriety of having fed a Duke thin porridge from chipped bowls. Walter paced near the window, glancing repeatedly toward the road, clearly torn between dread and desperate hope that the ducal envoy, who had apparently been sent word of the Duke's discovery, would arrive soon and settle the matter one way or another. Julian himself sat near the fire, looking somehow both entirely at ease and deeply uncomfortable at once, a contradiction Eliza was beginning to understand was simply part of who he was, a man torn between the life he had been born into and the brief, honest freedom he had found within these humble walls. "The whole village knows," Eliza said, setting down the water buckets with more force than necessary. "By tonight, likely the whole county will know." "I feared as much," Julian said, rising from his seat near the fire. "Word of a missing Duke does not stay quiet for long, particularly once my own men began asking questions in the market square. I should have anticipated their search would reach this far so quickly." "Your men," Walter said, turning from the window with an expression somewhere between hope and dread. "Will they come here? Will there be consequences for the way we treated you, before we understood?" "The only consequence I intend to pursue," Julian said firmly, "is ensuring your family understands how deeply grateful I remain for your kindness. Whatever fears the village whispers into your ears, Walter, know that I hold no grievance against you or your household." But even as he spoke the words, Eliza noticed the tension had not fully left his shoulders, and she understood, with a sinking feeling, that whatever came next would not be so simply resolved. Titles and dukedoms did not exist in isolation from politics, expectations, and the rigid structures of a world she had never been part of, and no matter how gently Julian tried to reassure her family, the truth remained that a duke did not simply vanish from his estate for weeks without consequence, without questions, without powerful people demanding explanations. Those questions arrived, quite literally, the following morning, in the form of a small procession that made its way slowly up the narrow, snow-packed road toward the Marsh cottage. Eliza spotted them first from the window, 3 riders on fine horses, followed by the same carriage she had seen in the village square days earlier, its crest catching the pale winter sunlight. "They have found him," she said quietly, and beside her, Julian released a slow breath, some private calculations settling behind his eyes as he watched the procession draw nearer. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a weathered no-nonsense face, dismounted the moment the party reached the cottage, striding forward with an urgency that suggested weeks of worry finally reaching their conclusion. "Your Grace," he said, relief evident in every line of his posture as he bowed low before Julian. "We had feared the worst. The estate has been in uproar since your disappearance. Lady Ashcombe has sent word twice daily demanding news. Harold, Julian said, and something in his voice carried genuine warmth, the tone of a man greeting a trusted friend rather than a mere servant. I am well, as you can see. I owe an explanation, and I intend to give one, but first, I would ask that you and your men show proper respect to this family. They have sheltered me through the worst of the winter storms, at considerable cost to themselves, and I will not have them treated as suspects in whatever confusion my absence has caused. Harold's eyes moved to Walter and Nora, standing rigid and pale near the cottage door, and something in his expression softened, though it remained carefully professional. Of course, Your Grace. We had heard rumors from the village of some incident upon your arrival here, rumors of an offer made in jest. Eliza felt her stomach drop entirely, understanding at once that this particular piece of village gossip had already traveled far beyond Bramblewick's borders, likely growing more scandalous with every retelling along the way. She glanced at her father, whose face had gone the color of old ash, and steeled herself for whatever consequence might follow this final, humiliating confirmation. The offer, Julian said, before either Walter or Harold could continue, was made by a tired, frightened man during a fierce storm, believing he was speaking to nothing more than a common beggar seeking shelter. I took no offense then, and I take none now. If anything, Harold, I would ask you to make quite clear to anyone still spreading exaggerated tales that this family's conduct has been beyond reproach. Harold bowed again, accepting the correction without argument, though Eliza noticed his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than seemed entirely accidental. A quiet, assessing look that made her uncomfortably aware of exactly how the rest of the estate might come to view her. Not as Eliza Marsh, a farmer's daughter with calloused hands and mended dresses, but as some strange footnote in the story of the Duke's mysterious disappearance. The conversation that followed unfolded mostly beyond Eliza's hearing, as Harold drew Julian aside to discuss matters of the estate, urgent business that had apparently piled up during his weeks away, disputes over land boundaries, a delayed harvest tax that needed reviewing, correspondence from other noble houses that could no longer be ignored. Eliza watched from a distance as the easy, humble man who had carved hinges by their fire slowly transformed back into someone else entirely, his posture straightening, his voice taking on a crisp authority that brooked no argument, the full weight of his position settling visibly onto his shoulders once more. It frightened her, watching that transformation, not because it revealed some hidden cruelty in him, but because it revealed, with painful clarity, just how far apart their two worlds truly stood. The man who had teased gentle observations about her father's stubbornness, who had listened patiently while she spoke of her small hopes for the coming spring planting season, belonged, in truth, to a world of estates and taxes and noble correspondence that she could scarcely imagine, let alone belong to herself. You are troubled, Nora said quietly, appearing at her daughter's side as the two of them stood apart from the ongoing discussion between Julian and his steward. I do not know what to think, Eliza admitted. Days ago, he was simply a stranger by our fire, and now I watch him speak of harvest taxes and noble correspondence, as though the past weeks belonged to some entirely different man. He is the same man, Nora said, though her tone carried its own uncertainty. Only now you see the full shape of him, rather than the small part that fit within our cottage walls. Eliza said nothing, watching as Julian finished his discussion with Harold and turned back toward the cottage, his expression, when it found her again, softening once more into something achingly familiar, something that reminded her, despite everything, that the quiet, thoughtful man she had come to care for had not entirely vanished beneath the weight of his title. I must return to the estate, Julian said, approaching the small group gathered near the doorway. Matters have accumulated in my absence that require my immediate attention, but I do not intend for this to be a farewell. Your Grace, Walter began, his voice still carrying traces of the fear that had gripped him since the previous evening. Surely you have obligations far removed from a family such as ours. We would not presume. I have made no presumptions upon your family that you have not first extended to me, Julian interrupted, gently but firmly. You took me in when I had nothing, expecting nothing in return. I intend to return that generosity in whatever manner proves proper and welcome. With your permission, I would like to visit again, once matters at the estate are settled. His eyes moved, as he spoke, toward Eliza, and though his words remained carefully measured for the benefit of her parents, the meaning beneath them was unmistakable. at least to her. Whatever had begun between them during those quiet winter days had not ended with the revelation of his title. If anything, it had only grown more complicated, more fraught with unspoken questions about whether such a thing could ever truly survive the distance between a duke and a farmer's daughter. Nora, ever practical despite her earlier fear, recovered her composure enough to offer a proper response. "A home remains open to you, Your Grace, as it was during the storm." Julian inclined his head in gratitude, then turned to depart with Harold and the rest of his party, though he paused once more beside Eliza, before mounting the horse Harold had brought for him. "I meant what I said," he told her quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it over the sounds of Harold organizing the rest of the procession. "These past weeks were not some diversion I intend to forget once I return to estate business. You, and your family's kindness, mattered to me long before I knew whether it would be wise to admit as much." "And now?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper, uncertain what answer she hoped to hear. "Now," Julian said, "I intend to discover whether what began between us can survive the truth of who I am, or whether it was only ever possible because you did not know." He mounted his horse without waiting for a response, perhaps understanding that she had none ready to give, and the procession began its slow journey back down the snow-packed road, leaving the small cottage feeling suddenly, achingly empty in the wake of its departure. Eliza stood watching until the last of the horses disappeared around the bend, her mind churning with questions that had no easy answers. The village would talk for weeks, she knew, reshaping the story of the ragged duke and the farmer's daughter into whatever form suited their gossip best. Her parents would carry their own fears about what this strange turn of fortune might mean for their family's future, whether blessing or burden. And somewhere beyond the ridge, in an estate she had never seen and could barely imagine, the man she had known simply as Julian would resume his true life as a duke, surrounded by obligations and expectations, entirely foreign to the quiet cottage where their unlikely bond had first taken root. Whether that bond could survive the vast distance now stretching between their two worlds remained, for now, an open question, one that Eliza suspected would not find its answer easily, or without considerable difficulty for everyone involved. That night, as she lay awake in the small back room she shared with her parents, listening to the wind pick up once more outside the cottage walls, Eliza found herself thinking not of Julian the Duke, with his fine horses and urgent estate business, but of Julian the stranger, carving hinges by candlelight, speaking quietly of weariness and honesty, choosing, even for a brief winter season, to be known simply as himself. She hoped, with a fierceness that surprised her, that the man she had glimpsed in those quiet moments had not been left behind entirely on the road back to his estate, and that whatever came next, some part of that honest, unguarded connection might yet survive the weight of everything now standing between them. 3 weeks passed without word from the estate, and with each passing day, the fragile hope Eliza had carried since Julian's departure grew heavier with doubt. The village, having exhausted most of its gossip about the ragged duke and the farmer's daughter, began turning its attention to other matters: a disputed cattle sale, a young couple's upcoming wedding, the usual small dramas of a close-knit community. But within the Marsh household, the silence from the estate weighed on everyone differently. Walter grew quieter than usual, spending long hours mending fences that did not particularly need mending, his mind clearly elsewhere. Nora threw herself into spring preparations with a fervor that bordered on frantic, as though sheer industry might somehow summon good news from the direction of the ducal estate. And Eliza, though she tried to hide it, found herself glancing toward the road far more often than she would have liked to admit, half expecting, half fearing, the sight of a familiar rider approaching through the thinning snow. "You should not wait for him," Nora said one evening, not unkindly, as she watched her daughter pause mid-task to glance yet again toward the window. "A man such as that has 100 demands upon his time: estate matters, political obligations, perhaps even a betrothal already arranged, for all we know of such things." The word betrothal landed like a stone in Eliza's chest, though she had, in truth, already considered the possibility more than once during her sleepless nights. Nobles of Julian's standing rarely remained unattached by choice, and it was entirely possible, even likely, that some arrangement already existed, some agreement between powerful families that would make whatever had grown between them during those quiet winter weeks nothing more than a brief, forgotten diversion. "I am not waiting for him," Eliza said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "I am only curious what has become of a man who once sat by our fire."
Nora gave her a long, knowing look, but said nothing further, returning to her own work with the particular patience of a mother who understood there was little use arguing against feelings her daughter was not yet ready to name aloud.
It was Walter, surprisingly, who raised the matter most directly one night after supper. Once Eliza had retreated to mend a torn hem near the fire, believing her parents occupied with their own quiet conversation across the room. She caught only fragments of what followed, but they were fragments enough to understand the shape of her father's worry. "She thinks of him constantly," Walter murmured to Nora, his voice low but not quite low enough to escape Eliza's hearing entirely. "I see it in her face every time a rider passes on the road. I fear what will become of her heart if he does not return, or worse, if he returns only to explain some arrangement already made with a lady of proper standing." "What would you have us do?" Nora whispered back. "Forbid her from hoping? Eliza has never been a foolish girl. She understands the distance between a duke and a farmer's daughter better than either of us could explain it to her." "Understanding a thing and protecting one's heart from it are not the same," Walter said, and Eliza, listening from her seat by the fire, felt a sharp pang of gratitude and sorrow intertwined. Gratitude that her father worried for her happiness so deeply. Sorrow that his worry was, in truth, entirely justified. She said nothing that night to correct or comfort either of her parents, uncertain herself what comfort she might offer, when her own heart remained tangled in questions she could not answer. But she resolved, quietly, that whatever happened, she would not allow herself to become a woman defined entirely by waiting, by hope pinned upon a man whose world remained so distant from her own that even imagining it felt like reaching for something just beyond her grasp. It was this resolve that carried her through the following days with renewed purpose, throwing herself into the practical work of preparing for the spring planting alongside her father, learning new stitching patterns from her mother, even accepting an invitation to help old Mistress Bellamy card wool one afternoon, a task she would ordinarily have found tedious, but now welcomed as a distraction from her own circling thoughts. It was during this very task, seated in Mistress Bellamy's cramped but cozy kitchen, that Eliza first heard the rumor that would reignite every doubt she had been trying so carefully to set aside. "They say the Duke has summoned a physician from the capital," Mistress Bellamy said, her needles clicking rhythmically as she spoke, her tone carrying the particular relish of a woman who enjoyed being the first to share fresh gossip. "Some say it is for Lady Vance, the young noblewoman his late mother had long favored as a suitable match. Others say the summons concerns the Duke himself, some lingering illness from his weeks lost in the storm." Eliza's hands stilled over the wool in her lap. "Lady Vance," she repeated carefully, keeping her voice as neutral as she could manage. "Oh, surely you have heard of her," Mistress Bellamy continued, oblivious to the sudden tension in her young companion's posture. "A fine lady, well-connected, said to have been raised alongside the Duke since childhood. Many in the village always assumed a match between them was simply a matter of time, once the Duke settled his affairs and turned his attention toward marriage." The rest of the afternoon passed in something of a blur for Eliza, her hands continuing their work by rote while her mind churned through this new, unwelcome information. She had known, of course, that a man of Julian's standing likely carried expectations of an appropriate marriage, arrangements shaped by politics and family alliances, rather than simple affection. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing a name attached to those expectations, made the abstract fear suddenly, painfully concrete. By the time she walked home that evening, the weight of the day's conversation had settled fully into her chest, a heavy, aching disappointment she had not fully anticipated feeling so sharply. She told herself, repeatedly, that she had no true claim upon Julian's affections, that whatever warmth had grown between them during those winter weeks belonged to circumstances that no longer applied now that his true identity, and all its accompanying obligations, had come fully to light. And yet, despite every rational argument she constructed, the disappointment remained, stubborn and unyielding. She did not share Mistress Bellamy's gossip with her parents that night, uncertain what good it would do beyond confirming the very fears Walter had already voiced, and equally uncertain whether the rumor held any truth at all, village gossip being, as she well knew, prone to exaggeration and outright invention in equal measure. But the doubt lingered, casting a long shadow over the days that followed, and Eliza found herself withdrawing somewhat from the easy hope she had allowed herself to feel in the weeks immediately following Julian's departure. Perhaps, she told herself, it was better this way. Better to guard her heart against a possibility that had likely never been as real as her own foolish hope had allowed her to imagine. It was nearly a month after Julian's departure, when the sound of hooves on the road finally drew her attention once more, though by this point, she had grown so practiced at suppressing her hope that she barely allowed herself to glance up from the garden bed she had been preparing for spring planting. But this time, the rider did not pass by. This time, the horse slowed, then stopped entirely at the edge of the marsh property, and when Eliza finally looked up, brushing dirt from her hands with fingers that had suddenly gone unsteady, she found Julian himself dismounting, his fine traveling coat a stark contrast to the ragged garments she had first known him in, though his expression, when it found hers, carried the same quiet warmth she remembered from their conversations by the fire. "I did not send word ahead," he said, approaching slowly, as though uncertain of his welcome after so many weeks of silence. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion." Eliza stood, wiping her hands more thoroughly on her apron, uncertain what to say, torn between the joy that leapt unbidden in her chest at the sight of him, and the lingering doubt that Mistress Bellamy's gossip had planted so firmly within her. "You are always welcome here, Your Grace," she said carefully, deliberately formal, testing whether such distance might protect her from further disappointment. Something flickered across his face at her use of his title, a brief flash of hurt quickly masked. "I had hoped," he said quietly, "that after everything, you might still call me Julian." "I did not know," Eliza said, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack slightly under the weight of everything she had heard and feared over the past weeks, whether such familiarity remained appropriate, given all that has likely changed for you since your return to the estate. Julian studied her closely, clearly sensing the deeper current of doubt beneath her carefully measured words. "Something troubles you," he said. "Tell me plainly, Eliza. I would rather hear an honest concern than watch you retreat behind formalities that were never truly comfortable between us." And so, haltingly at first, then with growing directness, Eliza told him what she had heard, of Lady Vance, of expectations shaped by his mother's wishes and years of familiarity, of the entirely reasonable possibility that whatever had passed between them during those winter weeks had been, in the end, only a temporary reprieve from obligations that would always, inevitably, pull him back toward the world he truly belonged to. Julian listened without interrupting, and when she finished, something in his expression had shifted, a mixture of understanding and quiet, determined resolve. "Lady Vance is a family friend," he said finally, "nothing more. My mother, before her passing, did hope for such a match, it is true, but hopes are not obligations, and I have made no promises, to her or to anyone else, that would prevent me from pursuing what I genuinely wish for my own future." "And what is it you wish for?" Eliza asked, her voice barely above a whisper, uncertain she was ready to hear whatever answer he might give. Julian stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity written plainly across his features, close enough that the weeks of doubt and distance between them seemed, suddenly, to matter far less than the honest conversation finally unfolding between them now. "I wish," he said quietly, "to discover whether the connection I found within your family's cottage, during the honest, uncomplicated weeks before either of us fully understood what stood between us, might survive the far more complicated truth of who we both actually are. I have thought of little else since my return to the estate, Eliza, not Lady Vance, not the countless other arrangements my advisors have suggested might prove politically advantageous, only you, and whether I might yet earn the chance to know you properly, without ragged disguises or hidden titles standing between us." The garden around them seemed to fade into soft, unimportant background, as Eliza absorbed the full weight of his words, weeks of doubt and careful self-protection beginning, slowly, to unravel in the face of his evident sincerity. She did not answer immediately, uncertain her voice would hold steady enough to convey everything suddenly rushing through her heart, but she found, when she finally did speak, that the words came more easily than she had expected. "Then perhaps," she said, a small, genuine smile beginning to form despite her lingering caution, "you should stop calling upon me only when duty allows, and instead simply visit, as any honest man might, without the excuse of a state business trailing behind him." Julian's answering smile was the first genuine, unguarded expression of relief she had seen from him since his arrival, and for the first time in weeks, The heavy weight of doubt that had settled over Eliza's heart began, tentatively, to lift. In the weeks that followed, Julian became a familiar sight upon the road leading to the Marsh cottage, arriving not with the formal procession that had accompanied Harold on that first tense morning, but alone, or with only a single quiet attendant, trailing at a respectful distance. Word spread quickly through Bramblewick, of course, as word of anything unusual always did, and soon the village grew accustomed to the sight of the Duke's horse, tied outside the modest cottage on the edge of town, though the whispers that followed carried far more curiosity now than the earlier scandal ever had. Eliza found herself caught between two worlds during those weeks, the familiar rhythms of farm work and village life she had always known, and the strange, unfolding possibility of a future she had never dared imagine for herself. Julian, for his part, seemed determined to prove that his affection had nothing to do with fleeting curiosity, or the novelty of a humble winter shelter. Returning again and again, not with extravagant gifts or grand declarations, but with the same quiet, thoughtful presence she had first come to know beside her family's fire. He helped Walter repair the fence that bordered the northern field, arriving in clothes plain enough that a passing stranger might not have guessed his true station. He sat with Nora in the kitchen one rainy afternoon, listening with genuine interest as she explained the particular art of preserving vegetables through the harshest winter months, a skill, he admitted, with evident sincerity, that none of his tutors had ever thought to teach him. And with Eliza, he walked the boundaries of her family's modest land countless times, their conversations ranging from the practical concerns of the coming planting season to deeper questions about the lives they had each lived before the storm had brought them together. "You carry your title so lightly when you are here," Eliza observed one afternoon as they walked along the frozen creek bed that marked the edge of the Marsh property, the first hints of thaw beginning to show at its edges. "At the estate, I imagined such lightness would seem entirely out of place." "It would," Julian admitted, his breath visible in the cold air. "At the estate, every word I speak is weighed and measured by advisors eager to interpret its political significance. Every decision I make ripples outward into consequences I must consider carefully before acting. It is, in its own way, a heavier burden than I think most people outside such a position ever truly understand." "And here?" Eliza asked. "Here," he said, a genuine smile touching his features. "I am simply a man walking beside a woman he has come to admire greatly, discussing nothing more consequential than whether the creek will thaw fully before the month's end. It is, I confess, the closest thing to peace I have known since my father's passing, placed the full weight of the dukedom upon my shoulders, far earlier than I ever expected." This admission, offered so plainly, struck Eliza deeply, revealing a vulnerability, beneath Julian's composed exterior, that she had sensed during their earliest conversations by the fire, but had never fully understood until now. She found herself, in that moment, wanting nothing more than to offer him the same comfort and honesty he had shown her family during those first uncertain days of his arrival. "Tell me about him," she said gently. "Your father." And so, walking slowly along the thawing creek, Julian spoke of a father whose expectations had always felt impossibly high, a mother whose gentle wisdom had been cut short by illness when Julian was barely 16, and the years since spent navigating a court full of advisors who valued political advantage far more than honest counsel. He spoke of Lady Vance not as a rejected suitor, but as a genuine friend from childhood, someone whose company he valued but had never felt the particular pull toward that he now recognized, with growing clarity, in his feelings toward Eliza herself. "I disappeared during that storm," he admitted eventually, "not entirely by accident, though I never intended to become quite so lost as I did. I had grown weary of a life measured entirely in obligations and expectations, weary of never knowing whether the people around me valued my company or simply the power my position afforded them. I wanted, if only briefly, to discover what it meant to be seen as simply a man." "And did you find what you were searching for?" Eliza asked quietly. Julian stopped walking, turning to face her fully, the cold winter light catching the sincerity in his expression. "I found far more than I ever expected," he said. "I found a family whose kindness asked for nothing in return. And I found, within that family, a woman whose honesty and quiet strength have come to matter to me more than I know how to properly express." The confession hung in the cold air between them, and Eliza felt her heart racing with a mixture of joy and lingering uncertainty. Their growing closeness over these past weeks had been undeniable, but hearing it spoken so plainly, so directly, carried a weight that made the reality of their situation suddenly, urgently present once more. "Julian," she said carefully, "even if what has grown between us is genuine, and I believe, now, that it is, there remains the matter of what the world beyond this creek will think of such a match. A duke and a farmer's daughter. Your advisors, your court, the noble families, who likely still hope for an arrangement more suited to your position. Have you considered what obstacles such a choice might bring?" "I have considered little else," Julian admitted, and something in his tone carried both weariness and determination in equal measure. "There will be resistance, Eliza. I will not pretend otherwise. Some among my advisors have already voiced concerns about the wisdom of a match so far removed from traditional expectations. But I have spent my entire life allowing others to shape my decisions according to what seemed politically advantageous, and I find, increasingly, that I have little patience left for continuing down that same path when it comes to a matter as personal as who I choose to build a life alongside." His words carried a conviction that steadied some of Eliza's own lingering doubts, though a quiet worry remained, a concern not for her own feelings, which had grown clearer and steadier with each passing week, but for what such a match might ultimately cost Julian himself, in terms of the political stability and alliances his position required him to maintain. "I would not want your affection for me to become a burden that weakens your standing," she said honestly. "Your responsibilities extend far beyond your own personal happiness, Julian. The people of this region depend upon your leadership, your ability to navigate the politics of your position effectively. I would never forgive myself if my presence in your life caused genuine harm to matters far larger than either of us." Julian reached out then, taking her hand in his with a gentleness that belied the calluses now beginning to fade from his palms, as estate duties replaced the manual labor he had grown accustomed to during his weeks at the Marsh cottage. "Your concern for my responsibilities, even above your own happiness, is precisely the sort of honest, selfless character that convinces me, more than anything else could, that you are exactly the sort of partner I would wish to have standing beside me as I navigate those very responsibilities. A partner who understands the weight of duty, who values the well-being of others above simple self-interest. That is not a burden, Eliza. That is, I believe, precisely the strength I have been missing." Standing there beside the half-thawed creek, Eliza felt something settle within her, a quiet certainty that had been building slowly over the weeks since Julian's return, now crystallizing into full, undeniable clarity. Whatever obstacles lay ahead, whatever resistance his advisors or the wider noble world might offer, she found herself, for the first time, genuinely willing to face those challenges alongside him, rather than retreating into the safety of doubt and self-protection that had governed her thoughts during the weeks of his earlier silence. "Then let us face those obstacles honestly," she said, "rather than allowing fear of them to keep us from discovering what might yet be possible." Julian's answering smile carried a warmth and relief that told her, more clearly than any words could have, exactly how much her willingness to face those challenges alongside him meant to him. But even as the moment settled into something like quiet hope between them, Eliza understood that the true test of their growing bond had not yet fully arrived. Whatever resistance existed among his advisors, whatever expectations the wider noble world held regarding an appropriate match for the Duke of Ashcombe, would soon need to be confronted directly, and neither of them could yet know with certainty how such a confrontation might ultimately unfold. That confrontation arrived sooner than either of them expected, in the form of a formal invitation delivered to the Marsh cottage barely a week later, an invitation addressed to the entire family, requesting their presence at the ducal estate for a formal gathering, during which, the letter stated plainly, matters of considerable importance to the Duke's future would be discussed and decided. The ducal estate rose before them like something out of a story Eliza had once heard told around a village fire, its stone walls climbing high above the surrounding countryside, its gardens, even in the last grip of winter, arranged with a careful precision that spoke of generations of wealth and design. Nora gripped her daughter's hand tightly as their borrowed cart rattled up the long approach, and even Walter, usually so steady in the face of hardship, seemed to shrink slightly beneath the sheer scale of the place awaiting them. "We do not belong here," Nora whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, as a footman in fine livery approached to help them from the cart. "We belong wherever we are invited with honest intent," Walter replied, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. And Eliza understood that her father, too, felt the full weight of the gulf between their modest cottage and this world of stone halls and liveried servants. Julian himself met them at the entrance, dressed now in the full formal attire befitting his position, a stark contrast to the plain, worn clothes he had favored during his visits to their home. For a brief, unsettling moment, Eliza felt as though she were looking at a stranger once more, until his eyes found hers, and the familiar warmth she had come to know softened his otherwise composed expression. "Welcome," he said, extending a hand to help Eliza down from the cart with the same gentle care he had always shown her, regardless of the fine clothes now separating him visibly from the man who had once carved hinges by her family's fire. "I know this place must feel overwhelming. I promise you, it felt precisely the same to me once, and in truth, it still does on my more difficult days." He led them through halls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, past rooms filled with furnishings finer than anything Eliza had ever imagined existing outside of stories, until they reached a grand receiving room, where a small gathering of finely dressed men and women had already assembled, their conversation quieting noticeably as the Marsh family entered. Among them stood a woman Eliza recognized instantly, without needing to be told her name, from the particular way the other guests deferred to her, and from the assessing, not entirely unkind look she directed toward Eliza the moment their eyes met. Lady Vance was, Eliza had to admit privately, every bit as elegant as village gossip had suggested. Her dark hair arranged in an intricate style Eliza could not have replicated, even with an entire day's effort. Her gown, clearly the product of the finest tailors the capital had to offer. "So this is the young woman who has caused such considerable discussion among the Duke's advisors," Lady Vance said, approaching with a poise that made Eliza acutely aware of her own simple traveling dress, hastily mended the night before to present its best possible appearance. "Lady Vance," Julian said, a note of warning entering his voice, though Lady Vance simply smiled, unbothered. "I mean no insult, Julian," she said easily. "I am merely curious. It is not every day a duke abandons his own estate for weeks, only to return with his heart apparently settled upon a farmer's daughter he met while disguised as a beggar. You must admit, it makes for a rather remarkable story." "It is a story I am content to have told, however unusual it might seem," Julian replied evenly, though Eliza noticed the protective way he positioned himself slightly closer to her side, a small gesture that nonetheless conveyed his intentions clearly to everyone present. An older man, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, stepped forward from the assembled group, his expression carrying the particular sternness of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Your Grace," he said, his tone carefully respectful but firm, "I trust you understand the gravity of what you propose. This is not merely a personal matter. Your marriage will shape alliances, secure the region's stability, influence how neighboring houses regard our standing for generations to come. Forgive my bluntness, but a match with a farmer's daughter, however admirable her personal qualities might prove, offers none of those necessary advantages." "Lord Averill speaks for many among your advisors, Your Grace," another voice added, a younger man whose fine clothes did little to disguise the calculating look in his eyes as he studied Eliza with obvious skepticism. Eliza felt her chest tighten under the weight of their combined scrutiny. Every fear she had voiced to Julian beside the thawing creek, now standing fully realized before her, given voice by powerful men, whose approval, she understood with growing dread, likely carried far more weight in matters such as this than her own feelings, or even Julian's, ever could. But before she could retreat into the silence such fear urged her toward, she found herself instead recalling her father's quiet dignity during that first terrifying night of Julian's revelation, kneeling not from weakness but from honest respect, and she straightened her spine, choosing, in that critical moment, to speak for herself, rather than allow others to determine her worth in her absence. "Lord Averill," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, drawing the attention of the entire room toward herself. "You speak of alliances and stability, as though these are things that exist separately from the character of the people who form them. I cannot offer the Duke a powerful family name, or connections to noble houses across the region, but I can offer honesty, without calculation. I can offer loyalty, without the expectation of political gain. And I can offer a partnership built upon genuine understanding, rather than an arrangement negotiated for advantage. If such qualities hold no value in matters of this importance, then perhaps the stability you speak of has always rested upon a far more fragile foundation than any of you care to admit." Silence followed her words, a silence that stretched long enough to make Eliza's heart pound uncomfortably in her chest. Uncertain whether she had spoken with appropriate conviction, or simply overstepped boundaries she did not fully understand within this unfamiliar world of noble politics. It was Julian who broke the silence first, and when Eliza glanced toward him, she found an expression of such open pride and admiration on his face that some of her anxiety began, immediately, to ease. "Lord Averill," Julian said, turning back to his advisor with renewed conviction, "you have served my family faithfully for many years, and I value your counsel more than you likely know. But I have spent my entire life allowing calculations of political advantage to shape decisions that should, by all rights, belong to me alone. I disappeared from this estate, not out of foolishness, but out of genuine desperation, to discover whether any part of my life could exist beyond the weight of those calculations. What I found, during those weeks I spent disguised and unknown, was a family whose kindness required no calculation whatsoever, and a woman whose character I have come to value more deeply than any political alliance you might propose in her place." "Your Grace," Lord Averill began again, though his tone had softened slightly, perhaps recognizing the futility of pressing further against such evident conviction. "I do not doubt the young lady's character. I doubt only whether character alone proves sufficient protection against the very real political challenges such a match will invite." "Then let us face those challenges honestly," Julian said, echoing, whether consciously or not, the very words Eliza had spoken to him beside the creek weeks earlier, rather than allowing fear of them to dictate a decision that should, above all else, reflect genuine partnership rather than mere political convenience. Lady Vance, who had remained quiet during this exchange, studying Eliza with an expression that had gradually shifted from skeptical assessment to something closer to genuine curiosity, spoke up unexpectedly. "I confess, Julian, I had hoped, once, that our family's mutual affection might eventually shape into something more. But watching this exchange, I find myself reconsidering whether such an arrangement would ever have suited either of us particularly well. You have never looked at me, in all our years of friendship, the way you look at her now." Her words, offered with surprising grace rather than bitterness, seemed to shift something within the room, the tension easing slightly, as several of the assembled advisors exchanged glances that suggested reconsideration rather than continued resistance. Lord Averill studied Eliza for a long, measuring moment, then turned back to Julian with a slow, reluctant nod. "I will not pretend all concerns have been fully resolved by this conversation, Your Grace, but I have served this family long enough to recognize genuine conviction when I see it, and I will not stand in the way of a decision you have clearly made, with far more consideration than I initially credited you with." The tension that had gripped the room since the Marsh family's arrival began, gradually, to dissolve into something closer to cautious acceptance, and Eliza felt Nora's hand find her own once more, squeezing gently in a gesture of quiet, relieved pride. Walter, standing slightly apart, watched the exchange with an expression that suggested he had never quite expected his daughter to hold her own so steadily against a room full of powerful nobles, and something in his posture straightened with evident paternal pride. Julian turned to Eliza once the immediate tension had eased, his expression carrying a warmth that seemed entirely unguarded, despite the formal setting surrounding them. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, "for allowing you to walk into this gathering without adequately preparing you for the resistance you would face. I underestimated how directly my advisors would challenge you, and I am deeply sorry for the difficulty that caused." "I do not require an apology," Eliza said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own conviction. "If this is the world you inhabit, Julian, then I would rather understand its challenges honestly, rather than have them softened or hidden from me. I would rather earn whatever place I might find here through genuine effort, than have it handed to me without proper understanding of what such a place actually requires." Julian's expression, hearing this, shifted into something that Eliza could only describe as profound relief, mixed with growing certainty. And though he said nothing further in that crowded room, the look he gave her carried a promise that both of them understood clearly, even without words spoken aloud before the assembled company. Whatever obstacles still remained, whatever further challenges the coming weeks and months might bring, both of them now understood, with far greater clarity than before, that they intended to face those challenges together, rather than allowing fear or doubt to keep them apart any longer. In the days following the gathering at the estate, Julian made a decision that surprised even Harold, his steward, who had grown accustomed over the years to a duke who rarely deviated from careful, calculated action. He announced, to the considerable confusion of several advisors, that he did not intend to formally propose marriage until Eliza herself had spent sufficient time within the world of the estate to determine, with full and honest understanding, whether such a life truly suited her, rather than pressing forward with an arrangement she might later come to regret. "You could simply ask her," Harold suggested one afternoon, as the two men reviewed correspondence in Julian's study. "I suspect the answer would please you." "I do not doubt that it might," Julian replied, setting aside a letter from a distant cousin, requesting an update on the region's harvest projections. "But I have watched too many marriages within noble circles built upon hasty decisions and romantic conviction alone, only to crumble once the reality of shared life together revealed challenges neither party had properly considered. I will not ask Eliza to bind her future to mine until I am certain she understands, fully, what such a future would actually require of her." And so, rather than a swift proposal, what followed instead was a season of careful, honest courtship, unlike anything the noble houses of the region had witnessed in recent memory. Julian arranged for Eliza to spend time at the estate not as a formal guest paraded before curious nobility, but in quieter, more practical ways, walking the estate's working farms alongside its tenant families, sitting in on discussions of regional harvest planning, even attending, at her own request, a session where local disputes were brought before Julian for resolution. "You wish to understand the burden of the role, rather than simply the comfort of the title," Julian observed one evening, as they walked together through the estate's gardens, the first genuine warmth of early spring finally beginning to soften the lingering chill of winter. "I would be a poor partner if I only understood the comfortable parts of your life," Eliza said simply. "I watched you carry the weight of your responsibilities, even during those quiet weeks at my family's cottage, Julian. I would rather learn to share that weight properly, than discover, too late, that I was unprepared for it." Her diligence during those weeks did not go unnoticed among the estate's staff and tenant families, many of whom had initially regarded the farmer's daughter with the same skepticism Lord Averill had voiced so openly during that first tense gathering. But Eliza's genuine interest in their concerns, her willingness to listen carefully to grievances rather than dismiss them, and her evident understanding of the practical hardships facing families not so different from her own, gradually won over even the most hesitant among them. "She asks better questions than half your advisors, Your Grace," one elderly tenant farmer remarked to Julian one afternoon, after Eliza had spent nearly an hour discussing irrigation concerns with considerably more patience and practical understanding than several of the estate's formally trained officials had shown during previous discussions of the same matter. The Julian relayed this comment to Eliza later that evening, with evident amusement, though beneath the humor lay genuine pride at watching her navigate this unfamiliar world with such natural grace and competence. Lady Vance, too, surprised many by becoming, over the following weeks, something of an unexpected ally, offering Eliza practical guidance on the particular customs and expectations of noble society that no amount of natural intelligence could have taught her without direct experience. "You need not master every formal courtesy immediately," Lady Vance told her one afternoon, as the two women sat together, reviewing the proper etiquette expected during formal correspondence with neighboring noble houses, a task that had initially seemed overwhelming to Eliza, but grew steadily more manageable under Lady Vance's patient instruction. "Julian did not fall for you because you mastered court customs perfectly. He fell for you because you never pretended to be something you are not. Do not lose that honesty simply because you are learning new skills." It was advice Eliza took carefully to heart during the weeks that followed, approaching each new challenge, each unfamiliar custom, not as an attempt to erase the farmer's daughter she had always been, but as an expansion of skills she could add to that honest foundation, rather than a replacement for it. Not every obstacle during that season proved so easily overcome, however. A formal dinner hosted midway through spring brought together several neighboring noble families, many of whom had heard only the exaggerated village gossip surrounding the Duke's unusual courtship, and several arrived with expectations of finding a woman entirely unsuited to the role she seemed poised to eventually fill. "I confess," one visiting baroness remarked during the dinner, her tone carrying just enough condescension to be unmistakable despite its outward politeness, "I had expected someone rather more rustic, given the stories circulating about your origins, my dear." The comment drew a few poorly suppressed smiles from other guests, and Eliza felt the familiar sting of humiliation threaten to rise within her. The same mortification she had felt that first night when her father's joke had been made before a stranger she did not yet understand to be a duke. But rather than retreating into embarrassed silence, as she might have done weeks earlier, Eliza found herself recalling the conviction she had summoned during that first tense gathering with Julian's advisors. "I am precisely as rustic as my origins suggest, Baroness," Eliza replied evenly, meeting the woman's gaze directly, rather than looking away in embarrassment. "I have spent my life working the land, mending my own clothes, and learning practical skills that, while perhaps unfamiliar to noble circles, have served my family well through many difficult winters. I do not intend to pretend otherwise, simply to satisfy expectations of what a duke's companion ought to resemble. If such honesty proves disappointing to some among this company, I can only offer my genuine regret that reality has failed to match whatever story reached you before my arrival." A brief, uncertain silence followed her response, until Julian, seated beside her, spoke with evident pride coloring his voice. "I would add, Baroness, that this very honesty, this refusal to perform some expected role rather than simply being genuinely herself, is precisely what convinced me that Lady Eliza possesses qualities far more valuable to this region's future than any polished court manner could ever provide." The Baroness, recognizing the firm conviction underlying both Julian's and Eliza's responses, offered a somewhat chastened apology, and the remainder of the dinner proceeded with considerably more genuine warmth than its uncertain beginning had suggested. Several other guests, witnessing this exchange, found their own earlier skepticism softening considerably, and by the meal's conclusion, more than one noble family had extended genuine, unprompted invitations for Eliza to visit their own estates in the coming months. Invitations offered not out of political calculation, but out of authentic curiosity about the remarkable young woman who had captured the Duke's genuine affection. That evening, once the guests had departed and the estate had settled into its quieter nighttime rhythms, Julian found Eliza in the same garden where they had walked so many times during the preceding weeks, the spring air now carrying the first genuine warmth of the changing season. "You handled that, Baroness, with considerably more grace than I managed during my own early encounters with such condescension," he said, settling beside her on a stone bench overlooking the garden's modest fountain. "I learned from watching you," Eliza admitted. "During those weeks at my family's cottage, before either of us knew fully who the other was, you never once demanded respect through your title. You earned it, slowly, through honest actions. I have simply tried to follow that same example, even here, surrounded by people who might otherwise judge me only by where I came from." Julian took her hand then, turning to face her fully in the soft evening light. "Eliza," he said, and something in his tone carried a gravity that told her clearly the moment they had both been quietly building toward these past weeks had finally arrived. "I have spent this entire season deliberately holding back a question I have wished to ask you since nearly the very first weeks of our acquaintance, wanting to be certain, absolutely certain, that whatever answer you might give would be freely chosen, understood fully, rather than pressured by circumstance or obligation." "I understand your caution," Eliza said softly, her heart already racing with anticipation of what she suspected, hoped, was coming next. "I do not offer you a title, or wealth, or the comfort of a state life, as the primary reason I ask what I am about to ask," Julian continued, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability evident beneath his careful words. "I offer you, instead, the same honest partnership you offered my family, that first storm-swept night, without calculation, without hidden expectation. I have come to believe, more fully, with each passing week, that I would rather face every difficult challenge my position demands alongside you, than navigate a life of comfortable convenience alongside anyone else. Eliza, will you choose to build that life alongside me, not because circumstance has pushed us together, nor because my title demands some suitable match, but because you, freely and fully, choose it for yourself?" The question hung in the soft evening air between them, and Eliza felt every uncertainty, every fear that had shadowed the past months since that first embarrassing joke by her family's fire, finally settle into quiet, unshakable clarity. "I choose it," she said simply, her voice steady with genuine conviction. "Not because you are a duke, Julian, but because you are the same honest, thoughtful man who carved hinges by our fire, who listened patiently to my small hopes for the spring planting, who chose, even briefly, to be known simply as himself rather than his title. I choose you, freely, exactly as you have asked. The relief and joy that broke across Julian's features in that moment carried none of the careful, measured composure that had defined him throughout the season's formal negotiations and gatherings, revealing instead the same unguarded warmth she had first glimpsed during their quiet conversations beside her family's modest fire, months before either of them had understood how deeply their lives would come to intertwine. News of the engagement spread through Bramblewick and the surrounding countryside far faster than even the earlier scandal of the Ragged Duke had traveled, though this time, the whispers carried warmth rather than mockery. Mistress Bellamy, who had once warned Eliza so gravely of the dangers of offending nobility, now proudly told anyone who would listen that she had always suspected something remarkable would come of that storm-swept night, a claim that made Eliza smile privately, remembering the woman's far more cautious tone during their original conversation. Walter and Nora, for their part, found themselves navigating their own unexpected transformation in status, no longer simply poor tenant farmers, but the parents of a woman soon to become Duchess of the very region they had worked so humbly for their entire lives. Walter, in particular, struggled initially with how to conduct himself during visits to the estate, torn between pride in his daughter's remarkable fortune and lingering embarrassment over the joke that had, however unintentionally, set this entire chain of events into motion. "You need not apologize further for that joke, Walter," Julian told him one afternoon, as the two men walked together through the fields that would, in time, become part of Eliza's own responsibilities as Duchess. "I have told you before, and I will tell you again, as many times as necessary, until you believe it fully. That moment revealed an honesty in your household that I had rarely encountered elsewhere in my life. Without it, without your family's willingness to shelter a stranger, without calculation or expectation, I might never have discovered what genuine partnership could actually feel like." Walter, though still occasionally prone to nervous over-formality when addressing his future son-in-law, gradually settled into a comfortable, if still somewhat odd, relationship with Julian, one built increasingly upon genuine mutual respect, rather than the fear that had gripped him during those first tense days, following the revelation of Julian's true identity. The wedding itself, when it finally took place during the full bloom of early summer, reflected the same deliberate honesty that had characterized Julian and Eliza's entire courtship. Rather than the extravagant, politically calculated affair many among the noble houses had perhaps expected, Julian and Eliza chose instead a ceremony that honored both worlds they now belonged to equally, held not within the grand formal halls of the estate, but in the gardens where so many of their most important conversations had unfolded, with guests drawn as much from the tenant families and village neighbors who had known Eliza her entire life, as from the noble houses whose approval had once seemed so uncertain. Lady Vance, true to the gracious warmth she had shown throughout the preceding months, stood among the honored guests, having become, somewhat unexpectedly, one of Eliza's closest confidants within the noble circles she now navigated with growing confidence. Lord Averill, too, attended, offering Eliza a formal bow of respect that carried genuine warmth, rather than the skeptical reluctance he had shown during their first difficult meeting. "I confess, my lady," he told her quietly during the celebration that followed the ceremony, "I doubted the wisdom of this match more strongly than perhaps any other advisor in this region. I am pleased, and I admit somewhat humbled, to have been proven so thoroughly wrong." "You were not wrong to voice your concerns, Lord Averill," Eliza replied graciously. "Your caution reflected genuine care for this region's stability, and I have come to understand, through these past months, exactly how important that stability truly is. I hope only to prove worthy of the trust you have since extended to me." As the celebration continued into the warm summer evening, Eliza found a quiet moment alone, with Julian, near the same fountain, where he had first asked her to choose the life they now, finally, fully shared. The garden around them, filled with the soft glow of lanterns and the distant sounds of music and laughter, felt worlds away from the small, storm-battered cottage where their unlikely story had first begun. "Do you remember," Julian said softly, taking her hand as they watched the celebration continue at a comfortable distance, "what your father said, that very first night, when he made that fateful joke?" Eliza laughed softly, the memory no longer carrying the sharp sting of embarrassment it once had, but instead a fond, almost nostalgic warmth. "He said you could have my hand for the night, since I kept the house warmer than any fire." "He was not entirely wrong," Julian said, smiling. "Though I think, in the end, it was not simply warmth I found within your family's home, but honesty, and kindness, and a partnership I did not know I was searching for until I found it, quite by accident, during the worst storm of that particular winter." "And now," Eliza said, leaning gently against him as the celebration continued around them, "that accidental joke has become something neither of us could have predicted, a genuine, freely chosen life together." "A life," Julian agreed, "built not upon the calculation my advisors once feared, nor upon the simple accident of circumstance that first brought us together, but upon something far more lasting, chosen deliberately by both of us, understood fully, embraced honestly." In the months and years that followed, Eliza settled into her role as Duchess with the same quiet, practical grace that had first won over even the most skeptical tenant families and noble houses during that careful season of courtship. She continued visiting the estate's working farms regularly, ensuring that the concerns of families not so different from her own childhood household received genuine attention rather than distant, disconnected governance. Julian, for his part, found himself governed by a partner whose honest counsel he came increasingly to value above even his most trusted formal advisors. A partnership built upon the same foundation of genuine understanding that had first drawn them together during those quiet winter weeks by her family's modest fire. Walter and Nora remained in their small cottage, despite Julian's repeated, genuine offers to provide them with more comfortable accommodations befitting their daughter's new status, insisting that the modest home where their family's remarkable story had first begun held too much meaning to abandon entirely. They visited the estate often, and the estate's grand halls, in turn, grew steadily more accustomed to the sight of a humble farmer and his wife, walking its gardens alongside the Duke and Duchess, their presence no longer a source of village scandal, but instead a quiet, enduring reminder of exactly how their family's remarkable fortune had first begun. And on quiet evenings, when the demands of estate business finally eased enough to allow for genuine rest, Julian and Eliza often found themselves returning, in memory if not always in person, to that first storm-swept night, to a crude joke born of poverty and fear, to a ragged stranger who had asked for nothing more than shelter, and had found, instead, a partnership that would shape the remainder of both their lives. It was a story the village of Bramblewick would tell for generations, growing perhaps more embellished with each retelling, but never losing the simple, honest truth at its heart, that genuine kindness, offered freely and without calculation, had built a bridge between two worlds that neither poverty nor privilege had ever managed to cross before. 5 years passed, and the region under Julian and Eliza's joint stewardship changed in ways few could have predicted on that first snow-choked night when a ragged stranger stumbled through a farmer's door. The harsh winters that had once threatened families like the Marshes with genuine starvation grew easier to survive, not through any sudden change in the weather, but through new granaries Eliza had insisted upon building after her own childhood memories of thin porridge and rationed bread convinced her that no family under their care should face the same fear her own had known. Bramblewick itself grew into something closer to a proper town, its market square expanding as trade routes shifted to pass through a region now known, among neighboring territories, for its unusually fair and attentive governance. Visitors who passed through often remarked upon the strange, persistent local legend they heard repeated in taverns and market stalls, the tale of a duke who had once arrived in the village, disguised as a beggar, and a farmer who had jokingly offered his daughter's hand without knowing the truth. Some travelers doubted the story entirely, certain it had grown into exaggeration through years of retelling. Others, upon meeting the Duke and Duchess themselves during official visits to outlying villages, found the couple's easy, genuine warmth toward common families so unusual among nobility that the old story suddenly seemed entirely believable. Lord Averill, now considerably grayer but no less sharp in his counsel, had long since become one of Eliza's most trusted advisors, the early skepticism of that first tense gathering having transformed, over years of watching her steady, thoughtful governance, into genuine admiration. He often told younger officials joining the estate's service that the region's continued prosperity owed as much to the Duchess's practical understanding of ordinary hardship as to any formal policy crafted within the estate's grand halls. Lady Vance, who had married a neighboring lord 2 years after Julian and Eliza's own wedding, remained a close and valued friend, visiting often, her own children growing up alongside the growing family Julian and Eliza had since welcomed into their household. Their eldest, a daughter with her mother's steady practicality and her father's quiet thoughtfulness, had already, at the tender age of 4, developed a habit of following the estate's groundskeepers around, asking careful, curious questions about how things were built and mended, much to Julian's evident delight and gentle amusement. Walter passed peacefully in his sleep during the 5th winter following the wedding, having lived long enough to see his daughter's remarkable transformation from a poor farmer's child to a duchess whose fairness and wisdom had become genuinely celebrated throughout the region. Nora, though grieving deeply, found comfort in the family surrounding her, and in the modest cottage she still refused to leave, now surrounded by the flourishing gardens Eliza had helped establish there during quieter visits away from estate business. Eliza never forgot the lessons of that first difficult winter, the fear of scarcity, the humiliation of her father's desperate joke, the slow, careful unfolding of trust between a family with nothing to offer but honest shelter, and a man who had everything except genuine human connection. She carried those lessons into every decision she made as Duchess, ensuring that the region's poorest families received the same dignity and consideration her own family had once shown a ragged, freezing stranger on the worst night of a harsh winter storm. Julian, for his part, often reflected privately that the greatest inheritance he had ever received was not the title passed down from his father, nor the estate's considerable wealth and land, but the simple, transformative lesson learned during those weeks disguised as a common traveler, that genuine worth had nothing to do with title or fortune, and everything to do with the honesty and kindness a person offered freely, without calculation, to a stranger in need. On the anniversary of that first storm each year, Julian and Eliza made a quiet tradition of walking together to the very spot along the road where he had first stumbled, half frozen, toward the light of a small cottage window, a private ritual that reminded them both, no matter how many years passed, no matter how the world around them continued to change, exactly where their remarkable partnership had truly begun. It had started not with grand declarations or careful political calculation, but with a simple, honest act of shelter offered during the worst of a winter storm, and a foolish, nervous joke that had, against every reasonable expectation, become the truest beginning either of them could ever have imagined. And so the story of the tattered stranger and the farmer's daughter continued to be told throughout Bramblewick and beyond, not as a fading legend growing more distant with each passing year, but as a living, ongoing testament to what could happen when kindness was offered without expectation, and when two people, from vastly different worlds, chose honesty and genuine partnership over the comfortable distances that titles and circumstance might otherwise have kept firmly between them.